If you're new in town or just new to this whole podcast thing, you're tuning in to Law by Night, the podcast that discusses all things vampiric with no fear of breaching the Masquerade. In this episode, we shall review Chaining the Beast, a sourcebook for Vampire the Masquerade. I shall present my thoughts and opinions on its presentation and mechanics to help you better decide whether this is the sourcebook for you. Six weeks ago, I presented a nice jolly top 10 list thingy where I shared with you some books in my collection that I enjoy more than others. Roughly half of them were books I'd reviewed on the podcast before, some I never mentioned, and a couple were almost off-brand. One of these books is Chaining the Beast, released the 30th of June 2005 as part of the revised edition line in Vampire the Masquerade. I know I've mentioned this book many times on social media and the Law by Night Discord server, and I may have mentioned it once or twice in the podcast as a go-to guide on the path of enlightenment. In any case, this book is long due a proper review on this podcast. But before we dive into the book review proper, here are the rules on the Law by Night book reviews. I will explore snippets of the lore, mechanics, and rules found within the tome. I will look as to how they are presented and how easily they are conveyed to new and old players alike. As this is a review written and presented by me, all thoughts and opinions are my own, so if you disagree with something I've said, that is totally fine. It does not mean that you are right and I am wrong and vice versa. As with my previous book reviews, I will start at the very beginning, which is the physical book itself, which currently sits neatly upon my lap. Unlike most of the books I've reviewed, this one is a soft cover rather than a hard copy, so I can't copy and paste the same part of my previous scripts this time. This book is practically painted with the infamous green marble pattern like practically every Vampire the Masquerade book before it and everything after it, up until the end of the V20 line, that is. The art on the front cover is particularly gruesome, something I feel could easily belong in Near Dark or The Lost Boys, as the vampire on his knees whose mouth is covered with blood as his victim's chest just explodes in a gory manner, his bones and flesh becoming an unpleasant reddish-pink mesh. Even if you don't know what the book is about, you know what its contents are, and they are going to be a little bit grim. That said, a title called Chaining the Beast leaves very little room for the imagination of what the overall theme of the book is. A lot of the artwork in the book is as visceral as its cover. Most of it, I feel, has quite the cathartic vibe to it, be it with more sinister undertones. A strange clash of emotions, I know, but that is just my reaction to it all the same. When you open the book, you are greeted with an opening story like you would find in most World of Darkness books that aim to set the mood of the book. I usually ignore these in my reviews, but this one differs greatly from its predecessors and many that came after it, as it's an utterly debased opening story of baby-eating vampires that is meant to shock and remind you that vampires are monsters. It is a lesson to newer players and a reminder to older fans that Vampire the Masquerade is a game of vampires grappling with their humanity, or rather, the memory of what it means to be human. Following this is the standard opening chapter describing in beautiful detail how vampires do not have humanity but faltering memories of said humanity, as I mentioned many times before in the podcast. They are not human and therefore do not have it. It is called the path of humanity for a reason. It also reminds experienced players that the Sabbat, who are the main practitioners of the paths of enlightenment, do not encourage the likes of the vampire in the previous opening story. They will destroy the vampires that reach such a diabolical state. The paths, for the most part, are not meant to totally indulge the beast. There's nuance and logic behind them all, parting the same horror found in more regular Vampire the Masquerade games. Just one side of another bloody coin. These themes continue into the first proper chapter of the book, which unpacks and expands what exactly the paths of enlightenment are, and how the failure of humanity is inevitable as the Canaanites struggle to uphold it, reinforcing the religious sentiments touched upon earlier on. There is this brilliant paragraph found at the bottom of page 13 of the book that carries over onto the 14th page that I'd like to read to you that sums up how most usually handle the paths and how they should be portrayed. Woohoo! I'm on the path of metamorphosis. I can run around and pull people's faces off. Yeah, and then I could stick their faces on a dog's butt, and I could suck 1,000,000 people's blood and spend all the points to cast a ritual that summons bat demons from hell, and then I can drink a demon's blood and have super blood points, and now my strength is 12, and I can kick this elder's ass and take his treasure, and that rules! Paths are cool! settle down. Contrary to some gamers' beliefs, practicing a path is not synonymous with I have no humanity so I can do whatever chaotic evil fuck I want and not suffer a lick of consequences, make the devil sign and insert badly hummed riff from Iron Man here. That is some crazy childish shit I'd write, but it's very valid. There are comparisons on these 2 pages to Path of Enlightenment and to the incomprehensible horrors of Lovecraft, and how those on the lower rating levels of the path are effectively the same ethical to those with the same rating on the Path of Humanity. Chapter 1 also goes into extensive detail about the few members of the Camarilla that would follow a path and how they go about doing it, which is vital for anyone wanting to include potentially ancient vampires in your VTM games, regardless of sect. Information is provided about the attitudes of Path of Enlightenment followers have towards mortals regardless of Path and the Camarilla, who they consider being weaker, delusional vampires, and others about vampires who follow the Path of Humanity, which, as a reminder, is a large majority. It also reinforces the ritualistic/cultic nature of the spot and how the systems to make a character starting on a Path of Enlightenment during character creation, a system that is only needed for editions of Vampire the Masquerade before V20, which has that included in the main core book. That said, the inclusion of it here brilliantly tells the reader it should be very unusual for starting characters to start on a Path of Enlightenment. This smoothly leads into Chapter 2, which talks about the spiral downwards of vampires' humanity. Every core book has a small section on what happens and how a vampire may behave when they start getting to Humanity 5 and below. They are brief enough for players and storytellers to understand, but vague enough for them to run rampant with the concepts and mechanics. This chapter of Chaining the Beast digs deep into most of the 10 humanity ratings, stopping at Humanity 3, which are characters that begin to struggle to function properly in standard chronicles, and how one may make the transition to humanity to a Path of Enlightenment in-game, explaining that it's by no means a simple process. Again, it is a change of philosophy. Conviction and instinct are explained in fuller detail here, as well as how to climb up that new Path of Enlightenment, something that is devoid in any other book I've read thus far. Whilst it is tempting for players used to reading various rehashes of things seen time and time again, don't skip over this portion of the book, especially if you are struggling to work out how your character should behave once they start becoming psychopaths. To that end, the chapter also details a variety of personality disorders that are somehow handled better than how V20 does their disorders, if only barely. Chapter 3 details the vast majority of Path of Enlightenments found across all editions of Vampire the Masquerade, some of which have been covered in varying degrees of previous episodes of the podcast. As such, I do not intend on breaking down each and every one of them in the review, because that would be a waste of everyone's time. That said, there are some elements regarding this chapter I wish to discuss. Each path follows a similar structure, which does make reading each of them an easier process. They start with an introduction, setting the mood and ideas what the path is about, the basic beliefs, which are not as basic to understand, which makes sense given the alien nature of the paths of enlightenments. The section also includes the hierarchy of sins and ethics for each path. Most provide a detailed and engaging history on how they came into being, and each path also provides descriptions of the stereotypical follower, how they behave, dress, and act in society as well, including a list of common mechanical abilities and preferred disciplines. For example, a follower on the path of Lilith, according to this book, prizes athletics, empathy, expression, crafts, performance, academics, medicine, occult, and science, whilst being drawn to animalism, celerity, fortitude, and obfuscate, hinting at the Lamia by stating the rumour there are those in Egypt that use necromancy. Whilst it is easy to think you can skim over this chapter because you own a copy of V20 that has the Path of Enlightenments in them, I have to admit that would be quite the stupid thing to do, given an archive of most of the Paths of Enlightenment is the very purpose of the book. Also, it is very clear when comparing descriptions of the paths in V20 and this book, descriptions provided in V20 is the equivalent of a weak wet fart compared to the detailed provided in Chaining the Beast. You get a sense that the authors of V20 had to sand down some of that early naughty's edge. That said, I feel that some of the paths in Chaining the Beast were holding back some of their immoral ethics, most notably the Path of Night. I am also annoyed that the Path of Metamorphosis has a weird passage about some Tzimisce wanting to go to space. It was just a very weird passage in the book that took me out of the experience when I first read it, as all I could imagine was that Tim Curry line from Command & Conquer Red Alert 3. Whoever wrote that needs a fucking slap. Whoever approved of it needs two. The final chapter in the book is probably one of the more deeply profound sections in any Vampire the Masquerade book I've read to date, starting out strong on what exactly humanity means to a vampire, stating it is an overused term. term. It provides various different ways for an ST to integrate players wanting to follow a path of enlightenment in their games, including plenty of story hook ideas and optional rules to make the degradation of their humanity and path far more difficult and dangerous. Finally, there is an appendix of notable figures for various paths which are interesting and engaging, enough to drop them in existing chronicles or inspiration as player characters. That said, I have never found any intention of including them or similar characters of my own. I am writing this review in late September 2021, and it will go live as a recorded episode in mid-January 2022. Assuming there are no further delays, the V5 Sabbat book will have gone live, and the fans of VTM will either love or hate it. The run-up to its release has caused some levels of controversy, which is a conversation for another time, a conversation that will probably happen when I get my own copy of the V5 Sabbat book. Many players have been rightfully upset regarding the lack of official rules to integrate Sabbat characters using Path of Enlightenment, and it does not look like Paradox and the World of Darkness team have very little interest in catering to that need for one reason or another. However, V5 has unintentionally allowed these features to be implemented through the Convictions and Chronicle tenet system, so if one is prepared for a bit of homebrewing, you can. While some may argue here that it is not possible to properly include the Path of Enlightenment's hierarchies and sins, I feel that it is easy to lose oneself in the mechanics and numbers and treat it like a game mechanic. The Paths of Enlightenment are a collection of spiritual ethos that are both strict and liberating, inhumane codes of conduct to keep the beast at bay. By human definition, they are alien ways of thinking, a mindset not meant to be understood by the kind or the humanity-keeping vampires, and thus never properly explored in most books. Chaining the Beast is a brilliant but ultimately flawed book that forces the reader to truly think and stretch their spiritual natures, to abandon concepts of humanity and embrace the beast of their characters. It is a near-perfect guide for anyone thinking about playing or running a Sabbat game or wanting to include more alien vampires in their chronicles. It is a masterclass on the balance between humanity and beast, and a must-have for any storyteller. Just keep your vampires on Earth and not some wacky base on the moon. And for those of you who are new to the Lore by Night brand and the reviews I occasionally do, I do not do out of 10 scores because they are subjectively pointless. One person's 10 out of 10 is another's 3 out of 5 stars, which is another's minus 42 out of 100, so I shall rate this book The Fate of the Dark God out of 10, as that is just as helpful as a proper out of 10 score. To be kept updated, follow the Lore by Night VTM Twitter and Instagram pages to find out when we upload each episode. You can also find out by subscribing to the YouTube channel and clicking on the little bell, as you'll be immediately notified when the latest episode is live. Until next time, farewell.